The city of Mariupol, now famous for the recently concluded siege of the city, has a younger history than many of the other cities in Ukraine and Russia, but a story no less interesting. The city's history is a crossroads between that of Crimea, both its classical Greek and Italian heritage, and its Turkic and Mongol connections, along with that of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. The city's eventual location along the Sea of Azov was originally in the wild fields of southeastern Ukraine, effectively a no man's land, eventually settled by the Zaporizhian Cossacks. After a 1774 treaty between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, there was now less of a threat to Zaporizhia and settlement began. In February 1776, ruins of ancient homes had been found on the site of the eventual city, with the famous Prince Potemkin planning a new showcase town of Pavlovsk. These ruins were assumed to be that of old Greek settlements, so the city was instead originally named Mariupol. This referred both to the Russian Empress Maria Feodorovna and the still Greek settlement of Mariupol in Crimea, which was itself becoming part of the Russian Empire. Eventually, the name of this new city on the Sea of Azov was shortened to Mariupol, still referencing the Greco-Roman heritage of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. There was an ulterior motive, however, as Russia pursued the Russification of Crimea. This led to the forcible resettlement of many Orthodox Greek Christians from Crimea to Mariupol, starting in 1780.
The Crimean Greeks also set up several other nearby towns, some of which were named after towns in Crimea.
Within 100 years, the city had become a major international trade center. By 1870, the population was around 5,000, and the port city was host to consuls and other international representatives from numerous European powers. In 1882, a major railway was completed connecting to the port, with wheat from the breadbasket of Ukraine, along with coal from the Donbass, exported via Mariupol. The first steel works then opened in 1898, with investments by Belgian and later French companies. The population continued to increase rapidly, and by the eve of World War I, Mariupol was home to 58,000 people, and was the second largest port in the southern Russian Empire behind Odessa.
However, with World War I going disastrously for Russia, major upheaval was at hand. On the 23rd of February 1917, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II was deposed and a provisional government set up. The war continued to rage, and Mariupol's growing industry continued to output materiel. On the 14th of September, the now vacant monarchy was officially abolished and a republic officially set up, still under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. However, of course, a second revolution, the October Revolution, would bring Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik Communist Party to power. For Mariupol, this would bring several years of chaos and destruction. First, Ukrainian independence was declared by independentist and anti-communist forces. Meanwhile, the old Greek centers of Crimea and the new cities that had been given Greek names, such as the port of Sevastopol, came under the control of the resurgent Crimean Tatars. However, then, both Crimea and Mariupol were conquered by the Red Army. They fell under the control of the Taurida Soviet Socialist Republic, led by communist apparatchik Anton Slutsky. Meanwhile, the Germans were now in control of the rest of Ukraine and had set up Pavlo Skoropadsky as the hetman of the Ukrainian state. By May 1918, the Germans had pushed the Red Army out of Mariupol and Crimea. They set up Turkic-Russian General Sulkowitz to head the new government in the south, with the German military retaining a heavy presence in Crimea, especially in the port of Sevastopol. However, the Germans were then forced to surrender on the Western Front in November, and as a withdrawal from the east was going to be required by the terms, the Sulkowitz government found its days numbered. By mid-December, French and Greek troops were disembarking at Odessa, Mariupol, and the ports of Crimea. The French retained military control in the west, while in the east and in the Crimea they retained the state that had been set up by the Germans. However, they replaced General Sulkowitz with civil servant Solomon Krim. The next year, the Red Army would storm back into Crimea and Mariupol. This time they were under the administration of the Crimean Soviet Socialist Republic, led by Vladimir Lenin's brother Dmitry, who still used Lenin's given last name, Ulyanov. These were very hard and war-torn years for Mariupol, where the rapid progress that had been made in the opening decades of the century was set back. However, things would get even more chaotic before peace would return. Mariupol and the surrounding region were taken over by anarchists, led by Nestor Makhno. He would retain control over this territory, which was nicknamed Makhnovia, and represented a rare large-scale attempt at forming some sort of anarchy-based society. In any case, the continued upheaval did not help Mariupol. By November 1920, the Red Army had recaptured the city, part of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, led by Grigory Petrovsky. In December 1922, Petrovsky would put his signature on the Treaty of the Formation of the USSR, and Mariupol became a part of the Soviet Union, still as part of the Ukrainian SSR, led by Petrovsky. Mariupol would undergo a rapid industrialization. In 1930, a massive steel plant many square miles in size was built on the Mariupol port. However, much of this industrialization was driven by the collectivization of agriculture. This policy was pursued with a particular vengeance in Ukraine, whose populace and party leaders were suspected by Stalin of fostering pro-Polish sentiments. This meant that not only did the Soviet NKVD secret police keep a close eye on the party leadership in Ukraine, such as Petrovsky, but harsh measures were enacted against the Ukrainian peasant population along with Jewish landowners. The Central Soviet state requisitioned all food and heavily restricted travel and access to cities so that starving peasants couldn't travel there to search for food. Stalin exported some of it while using the rest to feed the newly enlarged workforce of cities such as Mariupol. However, Mariupol being a Ukrainian city, and one with other ethnic minorities such as the Greeks, it was in many cases treated just as harshly as the countryside. Later, after the situation had subsided, Russian settlers were brought in to help bolster the devastated populace. The city had taken hit after hit over the past 15 years, however, some of its darkest days were in the near future. June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. By October, they were firmly in control of central and western Ukraine and had set up effectively a settler colony there under the iron-fisted leader of East Prussia, Erich Koch. However, Mariupol was not included in this, and it remained under the military administration in the occupied East. The Germans did plan to put Mariupol under the civil administration at some future date. However, with the military commanders remaining directly in control, plus the fact that the city had not been bombarded and was taken without a fight, meant that Mariupol and its industrial centers, such as Azovstal, remained intact and became an important resource for the German military, which it did not have to go through any layers of bureaucracy to control. However, the city's lack of destruction and control directly by the Wehrmacht did not protect it from the special commandos sent by the Germans to follow the wake of the front lines and execute partisans, Jews, and other suspected communist sympathizers. In this, they were helped by some local collaborators, many of whom had suffered under the reign of the communist regime. However, many more from Mariupol also fought in the Red Army, understanding that the Germans were attempting to wipe out Slavic populations long-term as well. Of course, much of the Ukrainian personnel on both sides was simply forced into it by their German or Soviet overlords. In any case, throughout the month of October 1941, the German Special Commandos executed around 9,000 Jews from the Mariupol area in several mass executions by firing squad. For the remaining Ukrainian, Russian, and Greek population, the fact that the city was not destroyed, like many others had been in Ukraine, did not prevent in Mariupol the dramatic population loss that had been suffered by those more heavily damaged cities. However, the loss in Mariupol wasn't quite as steep, and those who had gone mostly had left when the Germans first invaded and the Soviets evacuated much men and materiel to the east. Still, by June 1942, there were only 167,000 people in Mariupol, down from its pre-war populace of 222,000. This meant a significantly diminished workforce to keep the steel and metallurgy facilities running in support of the German war machine. This as the Germans were executing a siege of the still Soviet-held Crimean port Sevastopol, placing a significant strain on German military resources. By July 5th, the city had been captured, and the Germans now began their new summer offensive to the east, attempting to seize the Caucasus oil fields of Grozny and Baku. A major part of this campaign was the attempt to protect the Germans' northern flank and the capture of the city of Stalingrad, where a major urban battle developed with house-to-house fighting. This meat grinder put an even more enormous strain on the Germans' military resources, placing an even greater importance on Mariupol's industrial facilities, which became even more crucial to the Germans' ability to continue to pour large amounts of materiel into the Stalingrad shredder. Eventually, of course, the battle would result in a catastrophic German defeat, and by 1944, the entire area was back under Soviet control. Now, as mentioned in our documentary on the history of Russia and Ukraine, Stalin blamed the Crimean Tatars, along with other regional groups such as Greeks and Ukrainians, for collaborating with the Germans. The Tatars would pay the highest price, with a large majority of their population deported to the Uzbek steppe, where they would remain for the remainder of the Soviet era. Some did return after Ukrainian independence. After Stalin's death, something we've also mentioned before occurred, which would have large implications on the future, that being Khrushchev's transfer of the Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian one. In 1991, Ukraine did finally get its independence, as communism fell and the Soviet Union dissolved. In 2014, many of those old cities in the Crimea, where the Mariupol Greeks traced their origins from, would come under Russian control, following Russia's clandestine occupation and its staged referendum on declaring independence for the purposes of joining the Russian Federation. The renewed upheaval would touch Mariupol just a short time later. By the end of May, the city had been captured by Russian-backed separatists representing the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, led by Denis Pushilin. However, by mid-June, the Ukrainian army had recaptured the city as part of its counteroffensive, the anti-terrorist operation. Despite this, Russia would intervene with its own troops, and by the following February had secured a defensible front line. It then honored the second of two ceasefires that had been signed in prior months. Although the front lines were now frozen, it did not stop the constant shelling across the line of control, and deaths continued to occur in the mostly frozen conflict over the next 8 years. Meanwhile, Russia continued to shore up their control in Crimea, opening a bridge over the Kerch Strait, an indication to Ukraine that Russia would not let go, but this was followed by indications that Russia may not be done just yet. In November 2018, the Kerch Strait incident occurred in the Sea of Azov, where it meets the Kerch Strait near the newly constructed bridge. An angry spat between naval vessels of Russia and Ukraine occurred, apparently initiated by Russia in what became a major diplomatic incident. This saber-rattling wouldn't be the last time, and Russia continued to harass Ukraine's military in subtle ways over the next 3.5 years. Mariupol, as a frontline city and a major industrial hub, became an important center for the Ukrainian army and became heavily fortified against a hypothetical Russian attack. When Putin made his major address on February 21, 2022, one important action he announced was the recognition of the full claimed boundaries of the Donbas republics. Because Mariupol is within the Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine, it's part of the claimed territory by the Donetsk People's Republic. This meant that as the invasion began, Mariupol was firmly within the crosshairs of the Donetsk People's Republic and its Russian backers. Shelling of the city by the Russian proxies in Donetsk began almost immediately after the invasion began. By March 2nd, Russia's forces from the Crimea had met up with the Russian proxies coming from Donetsk, and Mariupol quickly found itself surrounded and under siege. Siege warfare is one of the few strong points of the Russian army, and their massive artillery force went to work blasting the city into rubble, attempting to ease their eventual advance and break the defenders' morale. By the end of March, the situation was more desperate as the city fell further behind the front lines. There was the connection to the Sea of Azov, but the value of the port access was lessened by a Russian blockade. The defenders in the destroyed city were hemmed in to a few select districts. Meanwhile, the Russians continued to saturate the area with artillery before their troops made any advance. This subjected the city to even more wide-scale destruction as the Russians blasted their way forward building by building. By the beginning of April, the defenders were still holding out in several core areas. The Russians continued to pour in massive resources, especially after their withdrawal from the Kiev area and the redeployment of many of those forces to the Donbass front, including the Mariupol cauldron. Eventually, the overwhelming resource advantage paid off, and the attackers isolated the Ukrainian defenders inside the Azovstal complex. Due to the constant shelling, the complex was not of use to Ukraine during the war itself, a major industrial loss. But now its maze of underground passageways turned the gigantic steel complex, which as mentioned earlier is miles across, into the last refuge for the Ukrainian holdouts in Mariupol. The Ukrainians swore to fight to the death. Russia, looking to avoid even more of a bloodbath than they'd already been subjected to in trying to take the city, sent several offers for the remaining Ukrainian units to surrender, which were ignored until the situation became impossible. On May 20th, the last large pocket of Ukrainian holdouts surrendered, with several other units still hiding out captured in the following days. Russia says that Mariupol's days as an industrial center are over, and that it will not be rebuilding the Azovstal plant, which had stood for 92 years. Instead, Russia says it will rebuild the now destroyed port city as a resort on the Sea of Azov. It remains to be seen whether Russia will even retain control of the city, or if a future Ukrainian counteroffensive will capture it back. In any case, it will take many decades for this unique city to put what may now be its darkest chapter in the past. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be updating the apolitical world map to reflect the current front lines in Ukraine and everywhere else in the world as of the start of this month, and we'll go over all those changes coming up on our 6-month roundup video. For now, check out apoliticalworldmap.org. Remember to subscribe to the channel and share our content. Give this video a like and comment down below. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.